Minnesota Vikings. I am your host, James Pagoshnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, including theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, I'm so glad the Vikings decided to do nothing of interest this week and really just take it off. Just nice and quiet stuff.
They're laying low, makes it very easy for me to do my job. Just, some transactional write-ups talking about, filling in some positions here or there, but, essentially, keeping the character of the roster the same. Love
exactly. It's about time that we just have a nice return to normalcy with everything that's going on with the virus and everything. Like it's times like this that make me feel proud that the Vikings have decided to completely just keep the ship going, just nice and steady, which they did with the extension of Kirk Cousins, and nothing else happened.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Yep.
So the opposite.
So that's the show.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in. Patreon.com/Norse Code. Thanks everybody. So let's begin with just thank you guys so much for listening. We have a massive show for you today. We have everything from the Diggs trade to Buffalo, the extension to Cousins that no one seems to be talking about anymore, everything else that's happened with the team. We have a little thing we're going to try a little bit later as well. We have the mailbag. There's so much stuff here to go over, but before we begin, again, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show and would like to donate to the show, you can do so in one of two different ways. You can go to paypal.me/NorseCode. That is a direct donation to the show. Or you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode as well. That is much more of a subscription-based. There are benefits to becoming a Patreon subscriber, which we'll discuss right now. We're actually going to be trying something a little different today. We will be going over most of the Vikings news of the day, and then before the mailbag, we are going to be doing a special Patreon-only section that you'll be able to get if you subscribe to the show. You can do so again at patreon.com/NorseCode. We're going to try it. It's at the $3.50 level. So if you donate to the show at that level, you'll be able to get the file that I'll be posting later this afternoon. So we're going to try it, see how it goes. One of the things that people have said that they would like is exclusive content from Patreon. So we're going to try this and see how it goes. We might be a little bit looser with the cursing, who knows? But the Patreon section is going to be more of around the league stuff. So let's get into the donations this week. Guy Incognito sent us a very nice Patreon message that he asked that we do not necessarily read on the air. But again, thank you, Guy Incognito, if that is your real name. Also, Dwayne on PayPal sent us a nice donation. Also, is attempting to dunk on Arif. So let's do this real quick. Arif, cool. The Vikings didn't have contact with Harrison Smith before the draft. What do you call the entire staff coaching him in the Super Bowl? Or sorry, in the Senior Bowl.
That would be phenomenal.
Let's aim for that.
Yeah, I wouldn't count that as a contact in terms of tracking player visits or team meetings, which is kind of how that was the context of the conversation. But you're right, I should have brought that up. Same thing with like Christian Ponder, where I don't know. I think they did meet with him at the Combine, but they did also like coach him at the Senior Bowl. That was a big part of their drafting. And I should point out, the Vikings tend to overdraft or overrepresent Senior Bowl players in their draft picks. And I think the fact that they coached at the Senior Bowl for a number of years, and then also it's very easy to have informal meetings with players at the Senior Bowl, is like a big part of their draft strategy, because it's easy to meet everybody at the Senior Bowl without anybody kind of noticing you're doing it, because everybody does it. So they don't really know kind of what positions or players you're kind of nailing in on. That's a good point. My bad. But in terms of like tracking who the Vikings were interested in, that's not helpful, right? Because they coached like 40 odd players at the Senior Bowl that year.
That is an interesting group of players that year for the Senior Bowl. Somebody had tweeted out, I think it was actually Kirk Cousins, who tweeted out the list, the Facebook of everyone who was like the stars of the Senior Bowl. And the players that really stuck out to me were, oddly enough, Kirk Cousins, Harrison Smith, and there was like one other player. Oh, come on, James. He was a Viking at one point too. But yeah, it was just interesting to see, like, wow, Harrison Smith, Notre Dame, son of a, yep, sure enough. Hey, if we're doing, we're recording this at a time when all this news is going on, so we do have the ability to say, breaking news, Phillip Rivers and the Colts have agreed on a 1-year deal.
Yeah, $25 million.
$25 million. Interesting.
Which, honestly, that's a little less than I expected, so good on the Colts.
I'm not even entirely sure, because Phillip Rivers, while a proven commodity, and we'll talk more about this in the Patreon section as well, but Phillip Rivers, you've just always had a higher opinion of him than I have. And
well, he's not good anymore, so it kind of doesn't matter. But yes, that's true. I've always had a higher opinion of him than you.
Yeah, the idea of him making a large amount of money seem like, I was maybe thinking like 20-ish, but 25 still seems high for the quality of player that you're going to be getting out of that. But that if they're happy, then go them.
If everyone's happy, that's all that matters.
Well, it's not my team, and I don't care about the East Coast anymore, so...
the East Coast of Indianapolis?
The East Coast of Indianapolis, yes. Anything east of Chicago is East Coast at this point. I'm not caring about any of that. Although we did get a lot of lovely recommendations, I believe from Raul on places to go to in Indianapolis to eat. So Arif is set for next year. So thank you for that. Also, before we begin, I just want to thank a number of listeners who have tweeted or have reached out to me in response to the dumb injury that I managed to have and am still kind of dealing with. I am doing slightly better, and I'm not looking at surgery. I'm able to do a hell of a lot more than I was even last week. The end of last episode, I was like halfway through the episode, my pain pill wore off, and so I had to take another one. And so if you listen back to last episode, by the end of it, I'm slurring a little bit, and I listened to that as I was editing, going, "Oh, lovely! I sound like I can't feel my feet. Fantastic!" But it was funny. It's like after I finished the episode, I moved the boom thing. I stood up and went, "Whoa, that." Hey, there we go. It's like the guy who's drinking at the bar and is doing shot for shot for shot, and he looks fine. And then the moment he gets off the bar stool, he like falls on his face. Like, it felt a bit like that was going on. So for everybody who's reached out, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I am starting to do much better, and I'm hoping to be able to return to work, which apparently means work from home now, soon. So I'll be dealing with all of the fun things of being a University of Minnesota employee. Go team. All right, let's start with the major news from yesterday, which is that Stefon Diggs is no longer a Minnesota Viking.
I half expected you to like slow play it and be like, which is that Britton Colquitt got a 3-year extension for $9 million. Like,
you know what? Yes. And I even asked on Twitter, like, what do you even start with? Do you start with Stefon Diggs? Do you start with Kirk Cousins? Do you start with CJ Ham? Like, the smarter bet would have been for me to go directly into like and start with CJ Ham and slow play it. The Diggs thing
too late. We're talking about Diggs.
Nope, the Diggs thing. It cannot be ignored. It insists upon itself. The Diggs portion is insane because it represents a number of things about this team that are both positive and negative, and a lot that either make complete sense or make you wonder what team you've been watching the past couple of years. Stefon Diggs has not been happy, and apparently has not been happy since last year in February, according to reports, and he has been traded to the Bills for a first-round pick this year, 5th round pick, 6th round, all those from this year, and then the 2021 4th-round pick for the Stefon Diggs, and this year's 7th. I believe that's accurate.
Yeah, the Vikings had to throw in this year's 7th to sweeten the deal.
Yeah, like this is. So on the one hand, Stefan Diggs apparently went to the Adrian Peterson school of just saying crap. And everyone just got to the point of ignoring Diggs and okay, he just says these things. And then it ended up amounting to something. And I was trying to figure out this morning whether or not this felt more like when Randy Moss left, but that seemed more like it was he was kind of losing favor and was doing things kind of incorrectly outside of football. Like seemed more disciplinary based. He was causing all sorts of problems and having like he was hitting people who were putting tickets on cars. Like, he was hitting meter maids by the end of it. So it didn't feel like that. It didn't necessarily feel like when Dante Culpepper left, when he was basically going through the newspaper in order to try to get out of his contract, like get traded to Florida.
Well, imagine if they had Twitter then. I think he would have just, taken to the tweets.
He just would have skipped the middleman. That might be an apt comparison to what ended up happening to Stefan Diggs, but this just seems so strange for a team that didn't look like it was going to be in a rebuilding stage.
The Vikings signaled earlier in the day that they were basically committed to kind of the win now mentality, right? Which is to invest in short-term assets to increase the odds of winning the Super Bowl by extending Kirk Cousins, committing themselves to Kirk Cousins in the long term in a way that makes it difficult for them to move on from him. And we'll talk about that in a second. And by signaling that, right, they clear up some cap space in order to do that, which allows them to sign free agents. That's not really something you're that concerned about if you're truly rebuilding, right? Because you're trying to shed contracts in order to, A, kind of move up the draft order by being a worse team, but B, finding roster room for younger players with more potential that tend to cost a lot less. So, the Vikings were clearly in an area where that they were investing in a short-term kind of all-in run. And then they get rid of maybe the most talented offensive player that they have. So it doesn't seem like it's something that you'd expect from a team like that. Trading him just for picks, not that the Bills have like a ton of players that could be included in a return package that would have a ton of impact for the Vikings that the Bills would want to include. Like, it's not like they would include Tre'Davious White, who would be kind of really a phenomenal fit for the Vikings. Because of that, because the Bills are also kind of in a win now mode, so they trade, potential for talent. It's kind of a pretty odd trade, and the Vikings are kind of pigeonholed into finding players in the draft that have the ability to start sooner rather than later. So, it does seem kind of out of character and out of odds. But on the other hand, like you said, reports are emerging that he wanted out from the team since OTAs or earlier last year. And it kind of confirms the general frustration that he's had with the offense. So, the Vikings might have just been in a situation where they were just like, they don't really have another choice, right? Because Diggs might hold out and choose not to perform and demand a trade. So better to do it now when there's a hot market before the draft than after the draft when a bunch of people have the receivers that they want. And there's a fairly weak market and you won't be able to realize those returns until 2021. So they found a way to, maybe they were forced into the trade because of Diggs' behavior, but they found a way to create 2020 assets instead of being forced to wait just on 2021 assets. So that might be kind of part of the logic that if Diggs was kind of just intent on not staying with the Vikings, this is probably the best case scenario. And I think in that light, in the light where teams kind of knew that Diggs wanted out, the fact that the Vikings were able to get as much as they did, I think is pretty excellent. And I think you mentioned this kind of earlier in the podcast. It kind of reflects some of the things that the Vikings are good at, right? So they're pretty bad at making sure that disgruntled players are happy and find reasons to stay, but they're pretty good at generating trade value. and crafting trades that advantage them. And so this is kind of one of those scenarios. But yeah, it certainly doesn't on face help the Vikings improve their odds to win the 2020 Super Bowl.
To be sure. And to me, and maybe this is just due to years of watching the NFL and watching Buffalo struggle in that division, it felt almost like a banishment. Like Diggs was being sent to Siberia. And maybe this is just like the feeling because, quite frankly, their quarterback is trash. You've basically said as much, maybe without using the word trash, but he's very inaccurate at best. And, you know, the number of picks we got is fantastic. The other names that were coming out of this were Washington, which I believe has the second pick overall, and that wasn't going to go our way, and New England. And they don't have another pick that they'd be willing to toss in for that. So we found the one team that has enough capital that desperately needs wide receivers for their quarterback who couldn't hit the broadside of a barn.
Yeah, and, you know, in fairness, the Josh Allen was not blessed with a ton of receiving talent on the roster, so this does immediately help him. Now it's John Brown and Stephon Diggs, two really great deep threats. In theory, taking advantage of Allen's ability to throw deep, which is not really a talent he has shown with remarkable quality or consistency, but he's got a big arm, right?
He does go to he did graduate from the Rex Grossman School of F it, I'm throwing this deep.
Yeah. So there's something there. You know, Stephon Diggs' skill set really kind of matches up with what Josh Allen's weaknesses are, right? Because he's really great at contested catches. He's got a large catch radius. He's really great at tracking the ball. He's got great body control. You know, he does a lot to make inaccurate quarterbacks look a lot better than they are. I mean, you know, he did a lot of that with Case Keenum. And Josh Allen's fundamental weakness is accuracy. So their ability to kind of erase one of Allen's kind of biggest weaknesses while maybe being able to take advantage of one of his strengths, which is his arm strength. You know, I think that could, you know, be perceived as a pretty good fit. He's good in the red zone, and he generates separation. Something that Greg Tomset, who writes for Cover One, which primarily covers the Buffalo Bills, you know, something he said was that because Allen is not a great anticipatory thrower, he doesn't like see receivers before they become open and throw the ball to throw them open. He has to kind of wait until it's pretty clear that they're open. They have to flash open, I think is the phrase he used. And Diggs is like very obvious when he's open, both because he like throws his hand up and tells you that he's just open, right? But also because since he makes like all kinds of explosive cuts, you know, he's not, he can be a smooth and fluid mover and he chooses not to be. He's not fluid in his route breaks. He's more explosive. It's very clear, right? That he's flashed open. So that can kind of help with Allen too. So there's a bunch of different aspects of the receiver quarterback tandem that really work in Buffalo's favor. Again, I don't think that, you know, Diggs is necessarily benefiting. And while I'm not confident the Vikings chose the Bills as a trade destination as a punishment, you know, it certainly would not be surprised if Diggs isn't happy by the end of it. Yeah, it's kind of curious. I think that accuracy just kind of just matters less to Diggs. I think he just wants the ball, again, especially if they're losing. So it could be a scenario where Diggs' numbers go down, but he's happier because he's getting more opportunities, which would be kind of funny to me. Yeah, there's something to be said there. I would not be shocked if there were other suitors that, you know, we didn't know about that had maybe more draft capital to kind of up the value of the trade, because I really doubt, you know, the Bills would give up a first round pick, a fifth and sixth, and a future fourth in a world where the Vikings didn't have like a different market somewhere else. I think that the Vikings needed to have the leverage of multiple offers that were relatively equivalent in value in order to get something as good as what the Bills offered. So, you know, I wouldn't be shocked if, you know, Arizona was in that market for a second before they traded for DeAndre Hopkins. I wouldn't be shocked if Miami was in that market. I wouldn't be shocked if, even the Colts were in that market, right? Because they've essentially got one receiver. So there's a possibility that other teams were kind of in on the trade that we didn't really know about right away. I think everyone kind of knew about Washington, and a lot of people were kind of curious about the Patriots. But I would not be surprised basically to hear about almost any team kind of being party to this trade. So a lot of capability for the Vikings to kind of leverage the other offers they had in order to get what I think is a pretty great return.
Is there another team in the NFL that is involved in more Vikings trades without actually being a part of them than New England? I feel like New England is the rumored destination for just about every player of like worth on the offense, from tight ends to now wide receivers. New England always seems to have their name in there, but are never actually traded over there. I
remember this rumor was like not that big, but I remember a Laquan Treadwell rumor. Maybe he can revive them. Everyone remembers the Cordero Patterson rumors, which ended up getting actualized when he actually signed with the team, which I thought was pretty funny. I mean, part of it's that the Vikings, have a wide receiver asset to trade away, and the Patriots always seem to need wide receivers, so that's probably part of it. But yeah, the Vikings seem pretty close to trading with the Patriots a lot.
Just they never seem to. They always seem to almost do it with the Jets, but that's merely to hurt the Jets emotionally, not for financial.
Yeah, both teams are really committed to emotionally abusing the Jets. That's true.
If there's one thing that we can agree on, it's that. Okay, so you could argue the face of the offense in Stephon Diggs is now gone at a time when the extension of Kirk Cousins is also being has also been announced. It's an odd time for the Vikings, to be sure, and I feel like one of the reasons why this is hurting Vikings fandom so much is because of his role in the Minneapolis Miracle. Because of, Stephon Diggs was a part of one of the greatest moments in Vikings history, playoff or otherwise. And had he not been the person who caught that ball and ran it in for the touchdown, I don't think that we have this much of an attachment to him. I feel like the attachment to him is based not solely on the fact that he was a part of this, but for a large part of it because of the almost deity status he achieved by being a part of this great thing.
Yeah, no, he's attached to the franchise in a really significant way. Obviously, the Minneapolis Miracle plays like a really big part of that. People have, their phone cases with Diggs's catch. They've got lock screens with Diggs's catch. People remember the call, Diggs sideline touchdown. Really,
it's so fun to troll Saints fans with that. It still is. If you go to the New Orleans, if we are allowed to have fans at football games in the fall, if you go to the New Orleans game, wear your Diggs jersey. They'll point out to you that he doesn't play for the team anymore, and be like, "Yeah, it didn't matter that day, did it?"
I think the most remarkable thing about the Minneapolis Miracle, and obviously there's a lot of remarkable things, it's a miracle, but the most remarkable thing might be that it began to repair the relationship between Vikings fans and Joe Buck.
It did! It's such a great, simple call, and we're able to troll New Orleans with it.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. It's up there with Paul Allen's no from the Cardinals game, I think in 2003. It's up there with disgusting act, honestly. Like, I think it's just so it's iconic, I think, in Vikings history. I think it's amazing.
One of my favorite things to do when I'm super bored and I just need a little bit of a pick me up is I find the Your Team Sucks from the season after the Minneapolis Miracle, and I pull up the New Orleans section And
Oh my
every
God.
couple words, Drew McGarry manages to put in Diggs sideline touchdown. It's almost like he couldn't hammer it home hard enough if he tried. It's so fantastic. Even the letters at the end, he's managing to put it in there too. It's a thing of beauty. Really
Incredible.
worth checking out. It's too bad. You know, and speaking personally, Diggs was easily my favorite player on the team. It sucks that my favorite player is so disillusioned with playing with the Vikings, is so upset with playing that he no longer wants to be in Minnesota and wants to go over to another place. So it's difficult. It sucks. We will endeavor to persevere. And there is a mini mailbag. I almost want to say a regular size mailbag considering the size of this, but we're going to go through some questions about the Diggs trade from you, the listeners. First question is from Nick. What does the Diggs trade do for our salary cap situation this year and going forward? There is a lot of dead money here.
Yeah. So the way trades work in terms of salary cap is that any money that is essentially accounting tricks, right? So the salary cap, for example, the Vikings paid out the salary cap in cash the day of signing. In theory, there's a bunch of ways to do it, but in theory, the Vikings provided Diggs with a significant amount of salary cap money on day one, but that didn't count against the cap in total that year. Because otherwise it would be impossible to sign a bunch of players to deals who want signing bonuses. Instead, signing bonuses are prorated for cap purposes out over 5 years or the length of the deal, whichever comes first. And so if it's a 5-year deal for $15 million, every year of the deal, there's a $3 million salary cap penalty essentially onto the contract that you add in addition to the base salary and likely to be earned bonuses and workout bonuses and stuff like that. And so that's all accounting essentially. You move that money around. So the money's already paid out, but for salary cap purposes, it's kind of moved around and is prorated out evenly over the course of the contract. So that's money you've already paid out. So because you have used that money to acquire a player and you have already paid it out because it's guaranteed money, you're liable for it. And so instead of a $3 million cap hit over the next 3 years for a player that's no longer in your roster, that gets accelerated into the current year. And the Vikings had 3 years or 4 years of a Diggs contract still left with the salary cap implications on it. And so that all gets pushed into this year. So Diggs' cost against the cap, if he was on the roster, was $14 million. By trading him away, they incur all $9 million of the salary cap hit, which then means they take $14 million off the books, put $9 million back on the books, which includes the salary cap bonus from this year as well, and then they get the difference in terms of cap relief. So in total, the Vikings acquired $5 million, or thereabouts, it's like closer to 4.9, but $5 million in cap space for this year. But the interesting thing is because they're because they'll structure contracts in a particular way in free agency, they can also use the cap space that they've cleared up for the next 3 years, which, because it was $12 million in terms of base salary for the next 3 years, they have created enough room to get essentially a player that would cost $40 million over the next 4 years, including this year. Or I guess because we're double counting the salary cap if we do that, actually closer to $50 million over the next 4 years. And so they get $10 to $12 million in cap space in terms of an approximate average value for a deal. So if the Vikings were interested in a $12 million player, say that's like Jaron Reed or, Justin Simmons, like if they trade Anthony Harris away, I don't know. Or let's say it's Anthony Harris. They sign Anthony Harris to like a 4-year, $12 million deal. They would not be able to pay a base salary of $12 million to Anthony Harris right now because they've only cleared up $5 million in cap space. That's a bad example because he's already on the books, but let's pretend it's a new Anthony Harris. So they would not be able to pay the full $12 million in signing or in salary this year. But they would be able to pay him an average of $10 to $12 million over the course of the next 4 years because they cleared up that cap space from Diggs. So that's the impact it has on the cap. If they decided that they wanted to sign, DJ Reader, who could go for $10 to $12 million a year, to replace Linval Joseph. They'd be able to do that by paying DJ Reader maybe $3 million in base salary plus a $10 million signing bonus, $2 million of which will incur this year, and increase the base salary in later years, essentially to be the same cost as Stephon Diggs. So that's the impact on the salary cap, is that it actually does free up. I think people only think of it in terms of $5 million, but it frees up a 4-year chunk of time that's worth $40 to $50 million. So that's really the best way to look at it, because that's how the Vikings construct their contracts.
Next question from Kyle Slaby. How many points per game does this offense lose with the loss of Diggs?
That's a really interesting way to put it. So PFF obviously is kind of like the go-to for, these wins above replacement, points above replacement type analyses. And their PFF WAR rankings, wins above replacement, I want to say Diggs was not the highest just because, he fumbled the ball a lot. He was liable for a number of interceptions. But he's, let's see, they've got like the 2015 NFL draft and, wins above replacement. So, the Vikings had the number 1 draft in 2015 in wins above replacement because of Stephon Diggs, but also, Eric Kendricks, Daniel Hunter, etc. I would not be shocked if Stephon Diggs is worth about, against a replacement player, 8 touchdowns. If he just evaporated, he'd be worth about 12 touchdowns. But a replacement player can get like 4 touchdowns, plus the yardage to get a number of touchdowns. So if we say, and he only got 6 touchdowns this year, I think that this year is kind of a down year in terms of wins above replacement or points per game generated if you include turnovers. But I think generally speaking, he is liable for a couple more interceptions that Adam Thielen is. He's liable for a couple of fumbles, although way more this year than in previous years. But he generates more yards. He gets open a little bit more easily. He's a little bit of a better contested catch receiver and so on. I would say around 2 to 3. But this is just like a really rough estimate. I would not be shocked if it was 5. I think 2 is kind of the low end. But if you've got an offense that's producing about 28 points a game, and now you're producing about 26 points a game or 25 points a game, that offense drops pretty significantly from, like 14th or 15th to, actually I could just take a look at the points per game metrics. But like, around 14th to 15th in a relatively modern offense or a relatively, scoring friendly environment, to, something a little bit closer to, let's see if we can get this in terms of points per game. Here we go. Yeah. So actually not 14th or 15th, 4th. Wow. 28 points a game is 4th or 5th. So if you're 28 points a game, and you lose about 3 points, you're at 25. So you drop from 4th to 10th. Or if you're at 25 points a game, you drop from 10th to 17th. And that can be pretty significant, obviously, right? Moving from a top 5 offense to a top 10 offense, or moving from a top 10 offense to a league average offense. That's pretty significant. The Vikings, were 8th in points per game, which is maybe not the best way to evaluate the Vikings because they had a few drives, so they were 6th in points per drive. If they move from 6th or 8th to 13th or 14th and have just a slightly above average offense, that's a problem, obviously. And so they'll limit their capability to kind of make the playoffs. They'll make a couple of games close that weren't close before. They'll turn, some 8-point games into 6-point games or 5-point games, and they'll turn some close games into losses. And so the net effect of that, the swing of 2-3 points doesn't seem like that much per game. The net effect of that, it might be 1.5 wins. So it can be really significant. It can be the difference between making the playoffs and missing the playoffs for a team that's kind of on the cusp like the Vikings seem to be. So that's the problem. The real question is not how much is Diggs worth kind of in a vacuum versus a replacement level player, but how much he gets back in a trade, which I don't know if this is like one of the questions that we got. But in terms of the ability to kind of replace the overall value that Diggs provides, let's say it's 3 points a game, right? 3.5 points a game. If the Vikings can find a receiver in the draft that adds like 1.5 points a game, now they've got to find a way to generate another 1.5, 2 points a game. They can do that with a cornerback that'll let them, have an above replacement level cornerback. Maybe that's half a point or a point a game. Let's split the difference and say it's 0.75. So now they're at 2.25 points a game. So they need to find another 0.75 points. That receiver helped. That cornerback helped. Now they've also got $10 million on average in free agency. And if they can find like a pass rushing defensive tackle, that generates about half a point a game. Now you're at 2.75, almost 3 points a game. And now all you have to do is see if you can kind of round out the depth chart with your 4th, 5th, 6th round picks. And maybe that alone can be worth, half a point a game. And so you can get a lot of that back, hopefully in year one. That's the difficult part. We talked about how, the Vikings are making moves that don't seem to benefit the 2020 team and more seem to benefit the 2022 team, one that Kirk Cousins wasn't going to be on, but now seems likely to be on. It's interesting. You probably decrease your total quality of team for 2020, but say you hit big on that receiver. Maybe he doesn't produce 3 points a game. Maybe he produces, 2.5. Now your other picks can be packaged to move up for an offensive tackle that will save you half a point a game or something like that. And then you're kind of in business because now, all of that extra cap space that you freed up is bonus because you've already hit the 3.5 point threshold. Now you've signed Nickel Roby-Coleman, who's just cut, and for $6 million a year. And now you're making even more, in terms of points per game than you were with Diggs on the roster. So, it's interesting. There's a wide range of outcomes there. I wouldn't say the Vikings, made the right move in a vacuum. I think they probably made the right move given the pressure that they had from Diggs wanting to leave. But the Vikings did need to take a risk. I don't know that this is the risk I would take if everything was kind of hunky-dory with Diggs. But the team as it's currently constructed, especially given the losses they're expected to have as a result of free agency on the defensive side of the ball, the team as it's currently constructed, I don't think has a very good chance of winning the Super Bowl. And so they needed to take a risk that would either, because we don't know how it plays out, would marginally increase their Super Bowl odds or massively decrease them. And those kinds of risks are pretty bad if you're an 8-8 team, but they might be pretty good if you're an 11-5 or a 10-6 team, or I guess 10-7, 11-6, depending on how the schedule works. Moving from an 11-win team to a 12-win team, or a 12-win team to a 12.5, 13-win team improves your Super Bowl odds pretty massively. If you're an 8-win team, you want to move up to 10 or 11 or 12 pretty quickly. But from 12, it's so difficult to move up to 13. So you need to create marginal improvements that are risky, that if they don't pan out, you'll lose 1 or 2 wins or even possibly 3 wins. And so this is that kind of risk where they might be able to hit on a player in the draft as a result of these picks or package the picks together and move up for a player. that is effective enough that is even better for your offensive efficiency or defensive efficiency than having Diggs on the roster. And so you're trading certainty of 2.5, 3, maybe 3.5 points a game for the unknown. And one part of the unknown is a better team. A significantly larger part of the unknown is a worse team. But you're not trying to improve your average wins. You're trying to win the Super Bowl. And so that equation is not meant to be balanced. You need to take risks to increase your odds of winning the Super Bowl, which is going to be harder and harder and harder the closer you are. And so the downsides to those risks are going to be bigger and bigger and bigger. So the average kind of win potential you add might be lower, but the high end of outcomes might actually get you what you want, which is a ring.
Everyone got that?
There's a lot there. Sorry.
I was looking at my recording thing like, yeah, we're really going on this. Okay. Slaby will be pleased that we spent, but that's an important stat, and it's something that, not just deep dive analytics, but that is something that will affect this team moving forward, like pretty immediately. Zen Cubid asks, reading the tea leaves, does the Diggs trade align more with Harvin trade /aftermath or the Moss trade /aftermath?
Oh, man. I would say probably the Harvin trade. I think the Moss trade, like, part of it was just like, I think the Vikings were just so confident that they could just very easily replace Moss, which is just like a really bizarre way to think about it. But the Vikings, based off of my memory, the Vikings just were confident that they could do it. I think with the Harvin trade, yeah, they were looking for a player that could replicate what Harvin did, which is why they traded up for Cordell Patterson. But I think that, they were kind of pushed into it more than they were with Randy Moss. And like you said, Moss was kind of crafting his own narrative on the way out. He was kind of pushing the Vikings in his own way. But I think the Vikings were pushed into it with Percy Harvin a little bit more. And given those circumstances, were able to kind of come out ahead. And I think at the time, given what people knew, Percy Harvin was worth a first-round pick. Obviously he didn't pan out after that. But I think given kind of the knowledge everyone had available to them, yeah, that was fine. I think it's kind of the same thing with Diggs. He's very clearly worth a first-round pick and then some. The Vikings were kind of pushed into this situation, but they can make the best of it. In a way that you're not trying to place a Hall of Fame receiver. Like, I think Diggs is really phenomenal. I think he's a really good receiver. He's not a Hall of Fame receiver. And the offense ran through him. He was the engine of the offense. He kind of drove their offensive efficiency in a big way. But, the Vikings do have, they've got Adam Thielen, who has the ability to kind of win. I say kind of win. I don't want to like underrate Adam Thielen in response, but they've got like other options. And Kirk Cousins, as much as I think Cousins is as reliant on a supporting cast as anyone else is in the NFL, I do think Cousins is primarily an efficient quarterback that will find ways to kind of push the ball down the field. Whereas with the Moss trade, he was more than just the engine of the offense. He was the identity of the offense. It had to run through him. And so replacing him was just so stultifyingly difficult. Whereas the Vikings have like a couple of other offensive options available to them. And finding a player of Diggs' talent is not nearly as like Herculean a task as finding someone even remotely close to Randy Moss's talent. So I think we're closer to the Harvin side of things. Because the way he worked in the offense, he was very clearly very important to the offense. Remember Harvin in 2012, that first half, he was playing better than Peterson was, and Peterson ended up setting some records in the back half of the season. He was a potential MVP candidate for what he was doing, both rushing and receiving. It's not that the Vikings would be able to find a player that can do that, although they certainly tried with Patterson. It's that they could probably find a player that could, do enough to ameliorate the loss. So I think we're closer to Harvin than Moss on that.
Boy, I'm just thinking about all of the times that Thielen gets open or BC Johnson gets open or Rudolph gets open because of double coverage or the misdirections that they were throwing on Diggs. the loss of Diggs is going to be felt in those areas as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Ugh.
It's so here's the thing, and I'll post another, and I'll probably end up writing it up at The Athletic eventually sometime this offseason. I'll take a look at the with-without splits with Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. But I do believe that Thielen without Diggs on the field drops off significantly more in value than Diggs does without Thielen on the field. Obviously, there's some problems with this kind of analysis because Thielen missed time this year when Kirk Cousins had an offense tailored to him and he was more comfortable and needed a little bit of a better offensive line, whereas Diggs missed time last year and the year before where Thielen had to deal with either Case Keenum or Kirk Cousins in a John DeFilippo offense. So the numbers are not a super great way to evaluate it, but it does seem to, there's some soft evidence that suggests that Diggs was more important to Thielen than the other way around. But yeah, I think the real impact will be felt on players like BC Johnson, Irv Smith, and Kyle Rudolph, who won't be able to get to benefit from the additional space that Diggs creates, especially because the way the Vikings kind of used Diggs a lot was that they would ISO Diggs on one side, and bunch the receivers on the other side. And normally you get single coverage on the isolated receiver, but Diggs drew the safety over to his side, even when he was isolated, essentially drawing two defenders to his side of the field and making the bunch on the other side of the field, a lot easier to throw to because now you're playing 3-on-3 on that side instead of 3-on-4. So, it's going to be pretty interesting to see what the geometric effect is on opposing defenses because, when it was just Thielen and Diggs, 2 years ago, I mean, Miami double teamed both of them, Seattle double teamed both of them, triple teamed Diggs once famously. I think we all saw that when he throws the hand up. The Patriots double teamed both of them. It was brutal. And I'm just trying to imagine what teams will do with Thielen now without Diggs to kind of force defensive eyes away from Thielen. It's going to be tough.
And the thing that Vikings fans seem to forget is that Thielen's older. Thielen is not young. Thielen was kind of a developmental guy for the Vikings for a couple of years there. Like he didn't emerge onto the scene until what his third year on the team. He really started to make himself a thing. You know, Thielen's getting older, so this isn't something that's going to be that's just replaced by Thielen's new on the team. He'll be fine. Like this is not something that's kind of replaced by Thielen's age.
Yeah, as of right now, today, Thielen is 29, Diggs is 26, so they're 3 years apart in age. Thielen will turn 30 right before the season in August, assuming the season starts on time. And Diggs will turn 27 a little bit later in November, about halfway through the season, again, if the season starts on time. So about 3 years of difference, which in the NFL is pretty significant. Receivers, lasting until they're 32, 33 if they're really good. Thielen already close to that theoretical retirement age 2-3 years out. So it's an issue. If you were to trade one of them without having to worry about drama off field or someone with a desire to leave, you'd probably want to trade the hometown hero because he's a little bit older, but probably carries similar trade value. If we assume that people are not worried about him coming off of injury, which I think after the performance in overtime against New Orleans, maybe they're not. But you probably want to trade away Thielen if you get the same return, just because Diggs, you get, 3-4 more years of play before he gets to Thielen's peak at age 30. So that's another concern. Thielen's 30. I think it's easy to forget that. Now that we talk about it a lot more, I think people are more aware. But it is easy to forget that because Thielen spent, I want to say 4 years at I want to call it Mankato State. I know it's officially Minnesota State Mankato now, but it's Mankato State. Spent 4 years at Mankato State. I want to say 4. I don't think it was 5. 4 years at Mankato State. And then in 2013 was on the practice squad for the Vikings all year. And so made the team in 2014. Compare that to somebody who makes the team in 2014 as a rookie, right? And Diggs arrived onto the scene a year later in 2015. But compare that to a rookie in 2014 that might be 21 years old, right? That's only spent 3 years in college. Thielen has 2-3 years of age on that person, and then Diggs arrives a year later. So it does match up. It does make sense, but it is kind of easy to forget that even though Thielen has only had so much time in the spotlight, especially as a starter since 2015 or so, he's only been on the team, quote unquote, for 4 years in a way that we recognize, right? As a starter, as a regular contributor, and he's already 30. So that's an additional concern. But the Vikings are again kind of all in. They're willing to bank on some veterans that are not going to be as effective in 2022, 2023. So that's kind of another kind of reinforcement of that mindset.
Let's take a look at some draft ideas, and that's what the next two questions are about. Ollie asks, how far would one of the top 3 wide receivers have to fall for the Vikings to think about moving up, or would they just stay no matter what?
That's interesting. So this, I think, ties into another question we got in the mailbag. So let me answer that question first to get back to this one. And that question was, if you package the 2 first-round picks together, how high up in the draft can you get? There's a couple of ways to answer this. If we use the old Jimmy Johnson developed draft value chart, which was developed in the late 80s, early 90s, as a way to evaluate all trades to see if they're equal, you end up moving up to, I wrote this in the show notes too, let me find it. You end up moving up to 7th overall, which seems pretty high, right? 22 plus 25 gets you to 7th overall, but that's what the point value says. If you take a look at how teams have historically traded, so Rich Hill at patspulpit.com, the Patriots SB Nation site, has, I think the chemistry term is decomposed, the value of a ton of trades between 2012 and 2016. And the importance here is that the trades come after the new CBA that increases rookie value because of the salary cap for rookies, and especially in the first round, because of the 5th round or the 5th year option. And so rookies are more valuable, especially in the first round. So he took a look at 124 trades between 2012 and 2016, and decomposed those trades into their individual component parts in terms of value, and ended up with the draft value chart, which I'll link in the show notes. And in that, you can package those together to get the 5th overall pick. Interestingly, if you take a look at how draft picks have historically done, by approximate value, which is not a great chart, and there's a new PFF study on that tests this. So I'll link that in the show notes too. If you take a look at the kind of analytics-driven trade value charts that rely on approximate value, the value of the 22 and 25, not the trade value, but the on-field value, is about equivalent to the 2nd overall pick, which is nuts, right? It's crazy. But these are the very same guys that, based off of this data, say that you should trade down as often as possible, unless there's a quarterback that you want. And so this is kind of higher picks are overpriced, lower picks are underpriced, and this is kind of the outcome of that. It's very difficult to believe that, Chase Young is worth the same as, say, Justin Jefferson and Christian Fulton. But when you think about it in terms of, who you might rather have on the roster, yeah, maybe Chase Young plus a replacement level player, or Christian Fulton plus, Justin Jefferson, 2 players expected to go around those 2 picks. Then you can kind of understand and justify it. It's tough to think about the 7th overall pick just because it's so far away from 25 that just merely packaging another relatively unimpressive first round pick seems kind of unintuitive, but that's kind of where you end up. So, back to that question, if the Vikings can package them together, who would they trade up for? You end up, I think the players that would fall that I would be very gung-ho about. CeeDee Lamb, Jerry Jeudy, Jedrick Wills. Those are probably the three players. If the Vikings did it for Derek Brown, I wouldn't love it, but I totally understand it. That's probably kind of where I would go if you traded up to 7. If you traded up to, let's say you packaged together picks 22 and 25 and ended up with like pick 13, instead of 7 and like a second round pick or something like that. If you ended up with the same value, but you ended up at the 13th pick plus some picks later in the draft, who would you then target? That's where I might be comfortable with Henry Ruggs, who I think has a couple of red flags, from an analytics perspective, less the market share flags and more kind of the size concerns. And then Jerry Jeudy kind of shortly after, who I think is a really remarkable player and has a lot of Diggs potential in a lot of ways, maybe around 15, 16. Those are the players I would trade up for. Tristan Wirfs I would trade up for at around, the same spot, 15, 16, 17. So that's kind of where I would pull the trigger on those trades. But it is tough to turn down 2 first round picks for one. But I understand it because it's very difficult to replace Diggs. Also, as a side note, I did find, Diggs's, expected points added over the course of the season, at PFF, and I'll link that. That's a PFF premium thing. So you have to pay PFF for it, but I'll let you in on it. He ranked 11th this year in expected points added among receivers at 1.52. So about half of my estimate. But again, that includes his really, really remarkably poor turnover rate, and his low routes per game. But we'll expect that to continue. So, I wouldn't worry about that too much. But players that produced, 93 yards per 35 routes, which is what Diggs was at, or 0.5 touchdowns per 35 routes, which is where Diggs was at, they tend to be around 2 points per game, which is Mike Evans, Chris Godwin territory. It's just the really remarkably poor turnover production that he had that really, I think, put Diggs in a hole relative to others. So I think generally speaking, 2.5 points, maybe not 3, maybe that was a huge overestimate. 2.5 points, is kind of where you'd put Diggs. And so you'd have to find, a player to the level of DJ Moore or, Devontae Parker plus another player, that's like the 25th best at his position in order for you to kind of get that back. So, that informs the discussion. Can you get 2 points a game from someone like Jerry Jeudy? Maybe. That's interesting to me.
And I suppose that's related to Professor Poop's question of, I am quite concerned with the potential poopiness of our wide receiver core. I know that this draft is famously not poopy with wide receivers. Will we have to draft a first-round wide receiver, or will a pair of mid-round, 3rd, 5th wide receivers replicate a decent chunk of Diggs' production?
I think earlier in this draft process, I would have been very comfortable with a 3rd and 5th round receiver. Now that we've kind of moved further along in the draft process, all of these receivers that I was talking about as really interesting 3rd, 4th, 5th round receivers have been kind of pushed up the board. My favorite, obviously, Denzel Mims, is now a borderline 1st round receiver. Brandon Ayuk, a 2nd round guy, is now a 1st round guy. Justin Jefferson, I think, at the end of the process was a 2nd round guy. Now he's a 1st round guy. He's like the 4th receiver. And so, a lot of these receivers that I was pretty interested in are now in a spot where, it's not as great kind of value for money, as it were. So I would have been pretty happy with a 3rd round pick, that along those lines, right? And you can still find like a pretty good receiver there, like Antonio Gandy-Golden. If Tyler Johnson's, physical thresholds are fine and it doesn't look like, the Minnesota's going to host a pro day or anything like that to confirm it. But if Tyler Johnson, checks kind of some boxes for the Vikings and they're not concerned about kind of the rumors that have been spread around about his off field, in the 4th round, I think that would be great and you'd end up in a pretty good spot. 5th round, you're entering territory where I'm like not in love with the receivers. Like maybe If Brian Edwards falls because he was injured all year, that's somebody to take a look at. He's kind of like he's reasonably athletic, pretty good route runner that should be getting more due, but just because he was injured, seems to be kind of in a bad spot. So you can maybe find some value there. But yeah, I think there's reason to worry about the state of the receiver corps, despite how excellent this receiver class is. You could still hit on some players that I like. I like Van Jefferson. On average, he's going around about the 112th pick in mock drafts. On average, Brian Edwards is going around the 113th pick. Those guys are guys I'd be pretty happy with. But like, you take a look at guys at 150 or so, and I'm no longer interested in them as potential wide receiver 3 or 4. And so there is a cliff in this receiver class that everyone loves. It just comes a lot later. If you drafted a Michael Pittman in round 3, I'd probably be happy. He hasn't moved up the boards as much as Denzel Mims has. So that's kind of somebody to take a look at. Donovan Peoples-Jones, that's somebody where you have to trust your wide receivers coach a ton. He's a super athlete that hasn't done a ton at Michigan. He's got some red flags. But in the 3rd round, you've got some upside option that's kind of in the take a big swing kind of category of players. Colin Johnson at Texas goes around the 100th pick in a lot of mock drafts. He's somebody to take a look at. But I don't love this 3rd round crop of receivers as much as I used to. Back when it had, KJ Hamler and Denzel Mims and even T. Higgins was kind of a 2nd rounder. Now he's kind of pushed back up into the 1st round. So, it's interesting. I was very comfortable with waiting on a receiver, up until the 3rd round. Now I'm a little bit curious, and not just because Diggs is gone, but also because, you're entering territory where everybody is alerted to how good these receivers are, and they're just getting pushed up and up and up boards.
Did we do enough justice to this topic? I feel like, even though we've spent over an hour, just about an hour on this, I don't even know if this is like sufficient justice to just how large of a change this is going to be to next year.
It's very weird. Like, there's a lot, right? I would say he was kind of the character of the offense. You said he's the face of the offense. He probably is, right? I don't think it's Dalvin Cook or Kirk Cousins, but certainly he defined what the offense looked like. When Diggs was running very short routes, when John DeFilippo had him run routes that on average ran shorter depth than Laquan Treadwell's routes, that offense was like stultifying. It was isolated. It didn't do a ton. When Diggs was running deep routes, it was explosive. It was exciting. It did a ton. He was able to win contested. He was able to win downfield. He was able to track down deep balls. It made the kind of the play action heavy throw it deep scheme work. Adam Thielen, obviously he's a really excellent receiver. He's almost as good as Diggs. And after you account for the turnovers this year, might be better. And he's been more productive than Diggs over the course of his career, obviously. So Adam Thielen's great, but I think he fits into whatever offense, which is maybe a better quality. I think he fits into whatever offense, but as a result, he doesn't define the offenses he's in. He just produces within them. And so now without Diggs, without that kind of explosiveness, it's going to look and feel really weird and different. We've been pretty used to what the offense looks like with Diggs in it for a while. So it's odd. It's unusual. I think that when they traded away Percy Harvin, everyone kind of had already shifted gears because we'd seen a half a season without him that year. And we're like, oh yeah, well, we'll just run for 2,000 yards again. I don't see the problem. But without like Diggs, it's just like, well, Cousins kind of needs to throw to guys. He's not great at throwing to nobodies. So, it's tough.
Yeah, ever since Diggs had his coming out party the first time, in a throwaway end of the season game against Denver, of all teams. And I only remember that because I remember I remember me putting the title of the show like Diggs does Denver. Like that was his big moment coming out. Ever since then, we have sat in awe of these circus catches that he had no earthly right catching. We watched him consistently get open and wonder why the hell Bradford, why the hell Keenum, why the hell anybody couldn't hit him more often. We watched playoff runs where he made spectacular catches, one of which we will undoubtedly remember until our dying days. Like, this is an all-time, you say like an all-time Viking. I don't think that he is better than Chris Carter. I don't think he's better than Randy Moss. But I do think he is one of the best Vikings receivers that they've ever had. And it's going to suck, but the Vikings will soldier on. And now that the Diggs situation has happened, it's almost like no one is talking about the Kirk Cousins extension anymore.
Yeah, it's, again, Cousins doesn't drive clicks. He's not kind of the soul of the offense, so it's very difficult to, for us to reorient ourselves around Cousins when the Diggs news happens. But, John Krasinski made a good point. He wrote an article at The Athletic, and he just said, hey, this puts the onus on Cousins now. It's very clearly on him as opposed to letting his supporting cast kind of play out and win games for him. So that's pretty big. But the key to this deal is that the Vikings save obviously $10 million in cap space now, but they've got a $45 million cap hit in 2022. Now, when this gets brought up, I think people tend to say, well, hey, 2022 isn't guaranteed. It's funny money. He's not necessarily going to see it. Or, hey, the cap is going to increase, and so it's not going to seem as big then as it does now. Which I think are both kind of fair points, but I think they're both incorrect functionally. So to the first point, that 2022 salary becomes guaranteed before the 2021 season starts. So if the Vikings finish 2020 with a healthy Kirk Cousins, they have to make a choice about whether or not they want him on the roster before, I think, the 5th day of the league year, which is normally fine, except no matter what happens, they are on the hook for his 2021 salary. So if they make a decision in 2021 before that league year that they don't want Cousins on the roster, it is true that he will not incur any guaranteed dead money hit in 2022. But he does incur a dead money hit that year. And so the Vikings would be forced essentially to keep him on the roster because otherwise they have to deal with a dead cap of, I want to say, $20 million. And so if they cut him in 2021, no worries for 2022, but they've got a $20 million hole in, a $40 million hole. Holy shit. Okay. So yeah, that's even worse. So if they cut him in 2021, they take a $40 million dead cap hit. So they free up negative $10 million in cap space. So they are functionally guaranteeing the 2022 season. So in order for the Vikings to say, hey, we want to cut you in 2022, they'd have to do it in 2021 when they incur a $41 million cap hit, but they free up 2022. Great. Which would be a $0 cap hit because that 10 million moves into the 41. So, that 2022 salary is technically not guaranteed except for injury. But it is functionally guaranteed because the only time they get to make a decision, the decision comes at the cost of $40 million of cap space. So, yes, the 2022 salary is guaranteed. You just have to treat it like it is. That means he's going to incur a cap hit, unless it's restructured again, which is, of course, entirely possible, of $45 million. Now, the second question of whether or not the cap is going to increase enough for that to seem like it's a very similar amount, I think that's really optimistic. I'm usually a guy that says we overvalue what the raw numbers look like and don't take into account the percentage against the cap. I think that is a wonderful way to look at cap space, is to look at percentage against the cap. If you take a look at so if the Vikings didn't strike a deal with Cousins now, it would be a $31 million cap hit. And that is in a cap environment where they've got $198.6 million of cap space to deal with. So you take a look at that, and that's about 15.6% of the cap. In order for that to be the same, you would have to have, I think, a total cap space of, $289 million. So you would be banking on the 2022 cap being $100 million larger, or $90 million larger than the 2020 cap. And the cap increases by like a percentage every year. Obviously, with the new CBA, there's going to be more cap space available, both because of the increased revenue share and because of a somewhat broader expansion of what counts as revenue for the purposes of salary cap. But I would not project an average $50 million increase in cap space over the next 2 years for that to bear out. If we take a look at, let's take a look at over the cap, which I think has actually Wikipedia just has a cap hit, history on its page. So, if we take a look at the Wikipedia salary cap page, generally speaking, over the past couple of years for the NFL, the cap has increased by about $10 million a year, since 2013. Which means the amount it is increased every year has decreased percentage-wise. So, like, you take a look at the 2014 to 2013 cap increase, and that was about 8%. If you take a look at the 2018 to 2017 cap increase, that was about 6%. And then 2019 to 2018 was also about 6%. So it's about a 7% average over the course of this CBA. If we assume a 10% increase average, you still don't get to $100 million new dollars in 2 years. So, I would not count on the expanded cap space to make that part of the deal look particularly good. I thought that Kirk Cousins was worth about $27 million, $26 million. When the Vikings signed him, they signed him for an average of 28. Fine, slight overpay. I get it. Now you're at a spot where his average is kind of fine, but you're going to have a year where he's going to consume so much of the cap that it's probably untenable. Like, let's say it increases by 10% every year. So you've got a $240 million cap in 2022. That is 19 or 18.8% of available cap space. And I don't think any quarterback right now consumes 18.9% or 18.8% of a team's cap space. So he would be the largest cap liability of any quarterback in the NFL that year. And that seems pretty untenable. And the Vikings are locked into it. So that's what you're in. And the Vikings did all of that to clear up cap space for this year. And that's why I think the evidence is so strong that the Vikings truly think they've essentially got a 2-year window, this year and next, to win the Super Bowl, and that they want to make moves that really increase their short-term odds of winning, even if it comes at the sacrifice of long-term odds of winning, because they just made that move. They just did that with Kirk Cousins. So that puts a lot of pressure, obviously, on Cousins, because the Vikings are committing to him long-term. He needs to prove them right. No one's going to care about this $45 million cap hit if they win the Super Bowl this year or next. And so that's kind of where you have to get to that point. You have to get to the point where no one's going to care. It's Cousins' team, and it's going to be Cousins' team potentially longer than it's Zimmer or Spielman's team, because now his contract finally, for the first time, extends past the contracts of the general manager and the head coach. And so I think you're in kind of a rough spot. The Vikings very much signaled that they're They're attempting to win now. They've freed up cap space. It seems like that cap space, initially it looked like the cap space was reserved essentially for Anthony Harris, because his franchise tag was $10.5 million. And Kirk Cousins freed up $10 million, but they might trade Anthony Harris. So I don't know. If they trade Anthony Harris, they've got, that 10 million, plus they've got the Diggs where they've got an average of another 10 million or something like that. They can go after a high value. If they go after like Chris Jones, that'd be really funny. Because they'd make a splash in free agency in a year where you didn't expect them to be able to do that. And then, hey, they don't have to get a defensive tackle in the draft. They could just like draft a high value receiver, a high value tackle, a high value cornerback in the first 3 picks, first 2 rounds. You're in a very weird spot. You know, that amount of money that the Vikings gave Cousins is interesting, but more importantly is the way they moved that money around. They committed to him through 2022, even if technically they did not.
It's a weird thing to look at, despite the fact that all signs over the past, I want to say 6 months, had kind of pointed to this situation.
Yeah, it is. Both from a Diggs perspective, right? Because of and you know, we'll talk about how wrong I was reading the Diggs situation in a bit when the mailbag calls me out. But also like with the Cousins stuff. I think that the way Zimmer talked about Cousins, he was more confident in Cousins than he ever was with Keenum. I'll say that. I won't say he had the kind of full-throated confidence that he had with Teddy Bridgewater, which is maybe an unfair standard. But, you know, he was pretty, like, emphatic. You know, I think we can win the Super Bowl with Cousins. Normally, that's coach speak, and you kind of just don't care about it. But, you know, Zimmer, when he's in player evaluation mode, tends to be fairly honest. And he was brutally honest about Case Keenum. Like, not even close. Yeah, wow, he's got a horseshoe, or, yeah, I really like his brass balls, but, you know, I think we can consistently win this guy. It's like, oh, how good is he? Well, he's a good person. Like that kind of stuff. But yeah, he didn't signal like that he wanted the team to like commit to him forever. But he did basically say we kind of want to work out a longer deal with Cousins in more or less, not that many words, but more or less. So yeah, the Cousins deal was kind of pretty well signaled, I think, over the past couple of months. The Diggs stuff, you know, well signaled, but, you know, I refuse to read the signs. So, there's a lot you can point to in the lead up to today. Breaking news. The Bengals land Trey Waynes.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. Reported by Tom Pelissero and Ian Rappaport.
Trey Waynes to the Bengals.
We usually think of the Bengals landing with the Vikings.
Typically.
Zach Taylor must have a great...
All
right, well, we'll talk about that in the Patreon portion, right?
Well, we might as well talk about it here in a couple of minutes, but geez, that's interesting.
Sure.
To say the least. Huh. So back to I love recording these shows when like a football game is going on and something major happens, or during in the middle of the day when all of the free agent stuff is still going on.
The best moment might have been when we were like watching the Myles Garrett saga play out live, and we were just like, "Oh, disgusting! Oh my god!"
I was like, "He may be going to jail for this." You're like, "Oh my god!" Yeah, it's interesting. So I feel like we're almost downplaying like the importance by how much we're talking about it, or how little we're talking about it as far as the Kirk Cousins extension, because this is an extension of the quarterback who's leading your team. But it is clearly not the biggest news of the day.
Yeah, well, I mean, Diggs just kind of has that gravity to him, right?
Yeah, I suppose. And fair or not, this is all going to end up reflecting on Kirk Cousins. And as you had said, this is, you know, Kirk Cousins' contract now extends further out than both the general manager and the coach. And they are tied to this pretty closely now. It's
it's pretty fascinating.
I just like that no one is talking about this. No one on Twitter is talking at all about Kirk Cousins.
Well, I mean, there's just like so much, right? Just from a Vikings perspective, obviously there's the dig stuff, and then you've got like the transactional stuff, and then nationally, you know, I think a lot of people would be talking about the Cousins thing for a week, right? If it had occurred during the season. But now, you know, we're covering the Tom Brady saga. We're covering the Houston trade. You know, we're covering the fact that the Dolphins have snatched up every player at the top of their position group in free agency. We're trying to figure out what the Bucs are going to do. We talk about, you know, Philip. There's just so much stuff, and people that are just inherently more compelling than Kirk Cousins, for better or for worse, right? I think the Vikings like that Cousins is boring and that he doesn't generate headlines. But like, the Panthers are like, yeah, we'll trade Cam Newton. What do you got? Like, what, really? Okay, yeah, let's talk about it. Right? So like, there's a lot happening right now. And so nationally, there's no reason to discuss Cousins all that much, because it's just like, yeah, the quarterback that's on the team is on the team again. Let's talk about like the 8 quarterbacks that are moving, right? And they're all interesting stories in their own right. Let's talk about the 2 blockbuster receiver trades, or let's talk about how the Bengals signed the top nose tackle and a good-ish cornerback. You know, there's a lot to talk about. So from the Vikings perspective, there's a lot of digs, you know, analysis, which is fair, I think, because Cousins is like already on the team, and now this represents a change in the roster. But I think that you're right, that this does deserve kind of its own discussion, because the Vikings very explicitly chose to hamstring a future year for this year. I think teams make decisions that hurt their long-term odds to boost their short-term odds, but very rarely do we see teams hamstring their long-term odds the way the Vikings did in order to boost their short-term odds. So it's very and this is what we were talking about earlier in the Diggs portion, where that $10 million is going to increase your win percentage, assuming you can sign that free agent. But that $10 million is going to increase your win percentage a small amount, a lot less than that $45 million is going to decrease your win percentage in 2022. But it's worth it, because losing is losing. It doesn't matter if you lose by 10 points or 20 points. It doesn't matter if you go 8-8 or 6-10. I'm still trying to think in like 17 game terms. I refuse
it's
to do
not going to get any easier.
So, 8-8, 6-10, that matters for the draft, but it kind of just, otherwise it doesn't matter. You're not in the playoffs, it doesn't matter. But the difference between, 11 wins and 12 wins is a first round bye and a possibility of getting into the Super Bowl a little bit easier and getting a Super Bowl ring. So those small odds at one end, boosting, $10 million of cap space, outweigh the terrible odds at the other end, because, hey, maybe 2022 was screwed anyway. So that's what the Vikings are doing, and they've basically bought into 2022 doesn't matter. 2020 matters.
This is yeah. All right, let's get into, well, I won't say the exact words I have on the screen for the show notes for this next section, but let's talk about everything else the Vikings seem to have done now. The first news that came out was that they have released Linval Joseph, Xavier Rhodes, and David Morgan. None of these were a huge surprise, albeit David Morgan not as what's the word I'm looking for? Not as, I guess, as expected as Linval Joseph and Xavier Rhodes, but these were 3 that you could probably see coming.
Yeah, the Morgan stuff I've been kind of low-key worried about the whole time. I think whenever there's been a discussion about tight end depth, somebody will bring up, well, David Morgan's coming back, and I've expressed a fair amount of skepticism. Now, I never had any indication that the Vikings would just cut him. I just got the sense that his injury was like prohibitively bad, like potentially career-endingly bad. No one told me. Eric Sugarman didn't pull me aside, and he's like, Arif, I've got a scoop for you, so long as you literally tell nobody. Nothing happened like that. I just got the sense from basically the way the Vikings acted, the way the other beat reporters acted, the way people acted at practice, that Morgan had a serious enough injury that he may not ever come back. So, I'm not super shocked by the Morgan stuff, but I wouldn't have put it on my list of predictions. So I think that you're right that this was not something that, was kind of high on our list of expectations, but certainly doesn't, hit our list of surprises either. Now, Linval Joseph, Xavier Rhodes, everyone expected, especially Xavier Rhodes. I think Linval Joseph, I expected him to be restructured, so I wasn't like the same as expected, but we expected some movement on the contract front with him, with certainly the possibility of him being cut kind of on the table, especially with how well Armin Watts has been playing at nose tackle. The Vikings indicated in their press release about the cuts for Xavier Rhodes and Linval Joseph, interestingly, not in a press release for David Morgan. Technically, the cuts occurred on different days, but the news broke at the same time, so that might be why. But they indicated for both Xavier Rhodes and Linval Joseph that they will continue to have discussions with them as free agency continues. And this isn't the sort of, you don't release a statement to say, we're good friends, we'll stay in contact. It's basically an indication that they're open to bringing them back in some way. So we could see Xavier Rhodes back at a highly reduced salary, and maybe there's a salary where Xavier Rhodes comes back, and I think everyone's fine with it. Like, obviously, if he plays for veteran minimum, and he's not guaranteed a starting job, I think basically most Vikings fans can accept that. Maybe I'm kind of overrating that because everyone remembers kind of the pretty bad plays, and you just don't want to be reminded of that. Like, people still treat Anderson Deo like he's bad and stuff like that. But I think that, that's probably a good move. And obviously bringing him back at like $14 million is an awful move. And so somewhere in between veteran minimum and $14 million is, I think, the ideal salary for both of them that represents his market value, but also, gives the Vikings kind of the latitude they need to not be forced to start him, but to have, a qualified, experienced player that's better than your replacement player at the cornerback position that's very familiar with the system. So I would not be shocked if that was around $4 million. I think anything in excess of $6 million is poor planning, and they should not do it. Linval Joseph, on the other hand, he didn't play up to his contract, but he played really well. He's no longer the pass rushing nose tackle he was, which is, I think, what that contract indicated, that he was kind of more than, your Damon Harrison type of nose tackle, where he was just really excellent at stuffing the run. Instead, he was really great at pushing the pocket for a nose tackle, as well as being great at stuffing the run. And he lost that fastball over the past 2 years in terms of pass rush. And he got a lot better as a run defender this year over last. So he got a lot of his play back, but I don't think he has as much juice as a pass rusher as he did in 2015, 2016, when things really got going a year or two after he had signed with the Vikings. So that's there. That's a part of the analysis that the Vikings probably made. And so they'll bring him back. I don't know at what cost. I would not want it to be above $8 million. Again, a $4 million contract, I think, seems ideal, but I doubt it. I think he gets more elsewhere. So that's going to be interesting to monitor. He obviously loves it in Minnesota, and he's been pretty open about it. What's super interesting to me is how attached players can get to the Vikings. I don't know how attached Xavier Rhodes is, but Mackenzie Alexander, I'm pretty confident, wants to leave. Jaron Kearse just basically said, get me out of here. Stephon Diggs said, get me out of here. They want to leave, right? And so you're like, oh man, does the coaching staff, or does Kirk Cousins or something, is there something about the team that like drives people away? Does this need to be addressed? And then you think Anthony Barr like left the Jets at the altar, right? To come to Minnesota, right? Everson Griffin I'm super confident is going to come back. He's professed, his love for the team on a number of occasions. So some players seem like really dedicated to the team and the coaches and stuff like that. And some players are like, I just hate this environment so much. That's fascinating to me.
Terrence Newman was the perfect example of that. Terrence Newman looked at retirement and went, no, I'm good.
Right. He chose not to retire. He chose to spend another 2-3 years with Mike Zimmer. And then after his career was probably done. I think he could have played another year, but so the story is he retired so that the Vikings could keep more cornerbacks on the roster, and he transitioned to coaching. So he could still be around the team. And it turns out, he doesn't like coaching because you have to be in the facility for 80 hours a week. And he's like, yeah, I'm just going to retire, but for real, and not do stuff. But yeah, it's interesting how some players are super, attached to the team and will take pay cuts to stay with the team, and other players are forcing trades.
Yeah. And obviously Trey Waynes, it was just announced that he's going to Cincinnati. That's an interesting move. The thing is you're just not hearing about a lot of players going to Cincinnati. You would expect if you're picking up the number one pick in the draft, who's expected to be a quarterback, that you would work at this point to maybe work on a line or maybe add a target or two. And no one seems to be going to Cincinnati except for Trey Waynes. It kind of resembles that whole, everyone is the disaster movie where everyone is leaving the town, everyone's leaving the big city, and there's one jalopy heading toward the city. It feels like that.
Yeah. That's I think so. They just released the numbers. I think we figured out why Waynes was so comfortable going to a team with the number 1 overall pick.
How much? How many million?
$14 million. $14 million a year. Yeah, how many? Yeah, $14 million a year. 42 over 3 years. What?
So that is
also breaking news. Kevin Durant tested positive for coronavirus. I'm gonna double. Is that a fake account? No, it's not a fake account. That's Shams. Jesus.
Yeah, a bunch of Nets apparently tested positive for it. So,
man, NBA players get access to those tests real easy somehow. Huh?
Somebody had a tweet that was
that's neither here nor there.
Well, there was a tweet somebody put out. It's how good of an NFL or how good of a basketball player do you have to be able to get a test? It's worth asking.
Everybody on the Jazz got a test, right? All 58 members of that team, both players and coaches got tested. So
yeah, okay.
I don't know.
So we're just breaking news at this point. Yeah, Trey Waynes, $14 million per. Wow. Yeah,
I like we say breaking news. Most people are going to be listening to this the next day.
Well, still doesn't matter.
Live reaction. Trey Waynes.
Here's something I enjoyed thoroughly, and I was all tweeting all about it. I was excited. I was going to get a new Pro Bowl jersey of his. CJ Ham extension worth $12.25 million over 4 years, including $4 million in 2020. The Ham is back. Second
highest paid fullback in the league, behind the Juice, Kyle Juszczyk. Who's not is it fair to call him a fullback?
Is it fair to call somebody fullback as talented and as utility as CJ Ham a fullback? The man runs, the man catches. You can throw a screen to him for reasons that make no sense. You can send him out into coverage. The man simply put does it all. He was Sean Hill before Sean Hill was Sean Hill.
He's Josh McCown. Let's be clear.
He could throw the ball. They haven't put him in that position yet. We could have a quarterback controversy in July theoretically. Have we seen him? Have we seen him kick yet?
We should, especially now that the Vikings have secured their long-term holder. We'll talk about that in a second.
Exactly.
This runs kind of, I think, counter to the Vikings' previous strategy at fullback, which I've talked about a lot, so I'm wrong about this too. This is what I love about free agency. I tend to be wrong a ton, and then the draft happens, and I'm right about 2 things, and I'm yeah, I'm nailing this. I've got a beat on the team. But for fullbacks, it really feels like the Vikings over the past couple of years have let rookie fullbacks play out their contract, and then they just let him go. And they're like, hey, we got another rookie undrafted free agent. He's been on the practice squad for a year. And I'm pretty confident, again, that the Vikings were going to do that, but the Titans stole their fullback. And the only reason it feels like that is because why the hell else would you have a fullback on your practice squad if that wasn't the plan? Yeah, you have a receiver on your practice squad. That's great. There's like a 4% chance he'll turn into somebody capable, and a 1% chance that he'll turn into a starter, and like a 0.5% chance he turns into Adam Thielen. Great. The receiver in your practice squad is not expected to end up breaking the roster. But like a fullback, yeah, there's a reason, right? CJ Ham was on a practice squad. Zach Line was on IR, but like a fake IR. And I think Tari Blassingham was supposed to be. So they, after Blassingham was, signed by the Titans, the Vikings decided to bring back Johnny Stanton, which is just such a great football name. It's like very, like, prep 50s, buzz cut, Johnny Stanton, former quarterback actually at UNLV, I think, turned to fullback, and they decided that no, they cut him once, and then after the season ended, they did not give him a reserve contract, which is pretty unusual. Almost always all 10 players on the practice squad get a reserve/futures contract to be on the 90-man roster. He did not get one, so the Vikings do not have another fullback on the roster, and they probably just decided, yeah, okay, we'll roll with this fullback. But they paid him a lot for a fullback. The Vikings don't have a ton of cap space. It's kind of weird to think, yeah, that Diggs trade, it freed up, enough space to sign CJ Ham. So, it's fair to motto.
Yeah, no, it made me happy momentarily yesterday, but it's different. I'll certainly grant you that. It again flies in the face of everything they've been doing, and it seems to not make a ton of sense on paper, but they found value in the ham. Who might argue with that? Non-exclusive franchise tag. Anthony Harris.
Yeah, well, so this is so people say non-exclusive franchise tag and then they raise their eyebrows. This is actually the more common franchise tag. The exclusive franchise tag is less common because it costs more. So here's the difference. So an exclusive rights or exclusive franchise tag, is the average of the top 5 salaries at that position that year. Which means we don't know how much it costs until all the free agents have signed. And then it gets bumped up as a result. The non-exclusive franchise tag is a very weird, complicated formula where they take the top 5 salaries for the past 5 years at the position, average them out in each individual year, and then prorate those years for the change in salary cap, right? Because the top 5 salaries in 2017 were in a $177 million cap environment, and in 2018 we're in a $188 million cap environment, or it's 2018, 2019, right? They were in different cap environments. And so they take whatever that average is for that year for the top 5, and they figure out what the percentage of the cap is. And then they average those percentages, and then those percentages average together are what the percentage of the current cap is. And that tends to be less. Or 20%, 120% of the player's current salary, whichever's higher. So that's what the non-exclusive franchise tag is. The difference, the reason that you would use the exclusive franchise tag versus the non-exclusive franchise tag is, of course, that it's not exclusive. If another team offers that player a contract, the player has the right to agree to the contract, but not without the right of first refusal from the Vikings. So the Vikings get the right to match that other contract, and then they get to keep the player. If they don't, if another team offers a contract, say someone offers Anthony Harris a 4-year, $60 million contract, $15 million a year, right? And the Vikings are like, that's too rich for my blood. We're not going to match it. And it has to be a match in exact terms, kind of like the poison pill. If they don't provide the exact same contract, then the player signs to that team, and then that other team gives a first round pick this year and a first round pick next year to the Vikings. So it's not exclusive, but like no one uses the non-exclusive part because you're trading 2 first round picks, plus a heavy contract for a player. Which the interesting thing about that is the only time you would do that is for a quarterback, but the only quarterback that's been franchise tagged really is Kirk Cousins. And so, yeah, no one was interested in trading 2 first round picks for the guy. Very curious.
Famously, repeatedly franchise tagged. The man can get money. Interesting to note that this is only the 3rd time in Vikings history that they have franchise tagged someone. The other 2 being Chad Greenway and Jim Kleinsasser.
Chad Greenway, Jim Kleinsasser, that's really funny. Did they franchise Kleinsasser as a fullback or as a... Well, it would be as a running back, so he must have been franchised as a tight end. Because fullback and running back, I don't think are separate categories in franchise tags. Just like tackle, guard, and center are not separate categories. It's just an offensive line franchise tag. Yeah. So it's probably as tight end. Because at the time Kleinsasser was playing, you don't want to pay him running back money to be a fullback.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just envisioning him getting franchised out of running back, like Kleinsasser going, I mean, sure, you can throw all this money at me, but...
Right, yeah, I'll take $8 million or whatever an insane amount of money in 2010 is.
Where am I lining up exactly?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'll do it. You want me to throw the ball? I'll kick it too. I don't care. I'll CJ Ham the whole thing.
Hey, Britton Colquitt extension. The deal is for 3 years and worth a total of $9 million. So Britton Colquitt is also returning.
Yeah, well, so every deal that has been like kind of perfunctory and transactional has been for like $3 million a year. CJ Ham $3 million a year. Britton Colquitt $3 million a year. I think there's like a 1-year deal I'm forgetting about right now that's like $3 million. Oh, the second round tender, restricted free agent tender to Eric Wilson, $3.1 million, 1 year. Kind of interesting. Yeah, Britton Colquitt, decent punter. I think as a punter, he's a little overrated. So yards per punt is like not a phenomenal statistic, but it is maybe telling that he ranks like 19th in the statistic. Now, if he is establishing a really long hang time and preventing returns, if he is getting inside the 5 without touchbacks and all that, that's well worth it, right? If he's doing it at a really high level. So it's not as if like average yards per punt is the way that we should be evaluating punters, but it's telling that he's not up there. That said, PFF, who worked with Chris Cluey to develop the punting grades, does rank him as like the 4th best punter in the NFL. Part of that is because of his really high hang time. He's 7th in average hang time. He had no touchbacks last year. He had 9 punts downed inside the 20, 6 punts punted out of bounds, 24 punts fair caught. So he had a low-ish return percentage. Not the lowest return percentage, but low-ish. I think among punters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12th in return percentage. So low-ish. So that's good. And when they were returned, they weren't returned necessarily all that far. He's about 15th in yards per return allowed. And so, even on plays where there was like a return, they tended to have enough hang time for the Vikings to be able to kind of, get down on the field. So a lot of, qualifiers here have kind of moved him up, but he's not like going to be consistently an amazing punter. I think this is the only year that by PFF grade, he outperformed his brother. In fairness, his brother did not have to punt too much in Kansas City. So, there's a little bit of that. But, yeah, a pretty decent punting performance. I would say overall, probably around 7th or something, in terms of punting performance. And that is a slight overpay. But the difference here is that he seems to be an elite holder. And Boy, does that seem to matter.
As it turns out, 100% matters much more than you would imagine, quite frankly. Whether it's confidence for Dan Bailey or not, there is a lot to say about his holding technique. So good.
Yeah. Elite. So altogether, probably a good deal.
Oh my goodness. Trey Waynes, his first year is $20 million.
Well, he gets $20 million. Yeah. I don't know that the cap hit it. Like, I think that includes signing bonus.
Yeah,
so.
He gets $20 million first year, averages 14 over the course of his deal. How could anyone look at the Vikings pass defense last year and go, you know what? That guy needs $20 million right there. There's $20 million. Maybe if you looked at it and went, out of all those players, there's $20 million worth of talent there. Fine. But not one specific player and going, yeah, that's $20 million right there. Good Lord. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to do something a little special, and we are going to take this opportunity to move over to Patreon. So if you subscribe to Patreon, you will be able to find both this entire episode uncut for this, or you'll just be able to find this section alone that you can just go to and find. So we are going to go over to Patreon right now to discuss the rest of the NFL losing its goddamn mind. All right, let's just jump right into the mailbag. And the Real HG asks, will you address Arif's poor predictions? He said Stefanski wouldn't leave to be head coach and that Diggs would not be traded. Discuss.
So I don't actually remember saying that about Stefanski. If other people remember that, like, feel free to let me know, especially if you remember, like, the episode or the article. That seems like a weird prediction that I would make, because that doesn't make any sense. That's kind of the goal. I think I said I hoped that, you'd have to wait a year because people didn't know whether or not it was him or Kubiak that designed that offense, and it took a while for him to get interviews. Maybe that's it. And maybe I predicted based off of those disadvantages he had in the process as reasons he wouldn't become a head coach. But that seems like an obviously bad prediction, so I hope I didn't make that. The Stephon Diggs one, yeah, I definitely said he would not be traded. I was super wrong.
As it turns out, everybody was.
Yeah, I mean, like, Chad Graff thought he wasn't going to get traded. I'm pretty sure Matthew Collar thought he wasn't going to get traded. I think there were a lot of indications that he wouldn't be, and I think the Vikings were pretty clearly not that interested in trading him unless they got a pretty good haul. And it just so happens that in a super rich receiver class, a team was like, screw it, I want that guy. I could have Jerry Jeudy, but I'm not that interested. I'm going to have that guy. So yeah, for like $12 million a year. I didn't think the incentives lined up for the Vikings, because, the Vikings have a quarterback that's fairly reliant on their supporting cast, and they don't have a ton of receivers. It would amplify a weakness already on the roster. I figured that it would be pretty attractive for teams because his contract is only $12 million a year to the receiving team in terms of cap hit. But I just didn't see why the Vikings would do it. And then also it really seemed like the indications from the team were such that they were not that super interested. And even before the trade was announced, there were even reports that the Vikings were taking calls for Stephon Diggs, but they were not making calls to trade him. And so they must have just gotten blown away by the Bills' offer. But yeah, super wrong about that. This, my bad.
You'll just have to be better next time.
I will. I won't be, but I'll have to be. Yeah. But I'll fail.
Duke's Code asks, what's more likely? Ham is our yards per reception leader next year, or Treadwell? I think Ham is just going to be the Yak King.
Yeah, and then we can call him Yam. Yeah, I think it's Ham. You drop him a pass 5 yards ahead of the line of scrimmage. He's got nothing but green in front of him. Visions of the end zone dancing in his head. Rumbles for 12 yards. That's a 17-yard gain. Does that every play. He's going to be the yards per reception leader. So, yeah, I'll pick that one.
Yep, that seems much more likely than Treadwell, who's just going to watch the ball soar next to him. And go, not today. Eddie, we already answered, so let's go to Chris, who asks, assuming the Harris trade happens, how many rookies will have to start next season?
Well, I don't think necessarily you get a safety to start. So you've got Anderson Deo. I think you're going to need a rookie to start at defensive tackles. So that's one there. Maybe a rookie to start at cornerbacks. So that's two. But that's only on the defensive side of the ball. Probably a rookie to start on the offensive side of the ball. That's three. And I think at wide receiver, and I think that's the max. And I think you can say that that's not necessarily going to be the case. So like, for example, if they get a rookie wide receiver in the draft, and Olabisi Johnson improves in a pretty significant way, then you don't have to have that rookie start. He can just supplement and maybe take over partway through, but he doesn't have to start, right? The same might be true at defensive tackle, where, Hercules Mataafa or Jalen Holmes improves pretty substantially, and you got your guy a little bit later in the draft, so he doesn't have to start right away. But I would project 3, even if Harris leaves or gets traded, just because they're probably going to re-sign Anderson Deo, so they're going to have a floor at that position, so they don't have to invest too much. And they've pretty much been kind of loath to invest at that position. Their investments have essentially been during the Leslie Frazier era when they drafted Harrison Smith, and then a contract extension for Harrison Smith. And then everything else is just like, whatever. So I don't think they're going to get like a second round or first round rookie at safety. I would be happy to be wrong, because that means it's a high likelihood it's Antoine Winfield, and that'd be fun to watch. But I would estimate 3 rookies, so I don't think it's that dramatic.
Next question is going to be from Bill Botke, who asks, the Vikings have major needs at cornerback, interior defensive line, offensive tackle, and wide receiver. How would you rank these needs, and which one can wait to be filled until the third round?
I would say cornerback first, just because they've got a number of holes at cornerback. And so you've got to address that one in multiple ways or right away. It is, I think, now after receiver, but before receiver happened, I would have said it's the most important position. Plus, you've got multiple holes there. Whereas at every other position, you've essentially got one hole. After that, I would say wide receiver, because you need to find a starter there. That's more important than finding an offensive lineman to play either tackle or guard. And it's more important than a defensive tackle, or even a defensive tackle plus the nose tackle. So you got to do that. Plus, then you add on the fact that they probably also need to add some depth, because I don't think Olabisi Johnson's going to cut it. So you need to add a starting receiver at probably the most important position of these, plus a backup receiver. And the only reason cornerback's ahead of it is because the difference in importance of the positions is relatively small, and you need multiple starters, not just like a backup. After that, I would probably go offensive line over defensive line. I think offensive lines tend to dictate a little bit more than defensive lines do, because they give quarterbacks kind of their range of outcomes. So it's not how much pressure an offensive line gives up. It's how much time before the quarterback feels like he's about to get pressured. And they've done studies on this. ESPN found that it's pass block win rate, not pressure rate, that helps correlate to offensive performance. So that's kind of interesting. Quarterbacks tend to hold onto the ball the same amount, essentially, after you adjust for like win rate. And so quarterbacks will invite pressure, but what they do once that happens, or how much time they get when they invite pressure, depends on the offensive line. So that's kind of interesting. But I would take an offensive lineman, especially an offensive tackle, over a defensive tackle. So that would put interior defensive line fourth. And that's the one that normally you'd say, because of the ranking, you'd say you can wait to fill until the third round. But because defensive line kind of falls off, you might want to address that one in the second round or even the first round. And then maybe also grab a cornerback in the second round, maybe grab the offensive tackle in the first round, grab 2 third-round receivers, or something along those lines. You can maybe wait on receiver in the third round based off of whether or not that estimation, that worry that I had earlier about receivers getting pushed up draft boards, is true or not. If you can't, then you gotta take one in the first or second round, plus maybe another one, and then you take like a cornerback or something. But it's going to be tough, because by the time you get to that fourth round, you're probably going to be running out of starters, and you really kind of want to grab a starter at every one of those positions, if possible. All
right, the next question is going to be from Logan, who asks, a series of quick questions. First one, if we only have kitchen table chairs, what do you recommend we do for lumbar and ergonomic at-home workstations? Pillows, my friend. Pillows.
Yeah, pillows are huge for this. Like, enormous for this. Mm-hmm. Like, don't underestimate how important they are. Both on the seat itself and then at your back behind you. That's critical. I would also, I'm not going to suggest a standing desk, because standing for 8 hours while working is actually very tough, and people suggest standing desks based off of somewhat dubious research about the productivity effects and health effects. But having a solution to stand for periods of time while working would be great. So if you can find a way to do that for a little bit while you're working, it'll kind of change up your environment in a way that's not distracting, and you'll be able to work. But I don't think that you have to transition to a standing desk or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, pillows.
Number 2, is it possible the Vikings forgot about Diggs' sideline touchdown? Because that trade makes me sad.
They must have forgotten about it.
You know, it's right around the time that they forgot about Dre or Trey. Will Diggs ever return as a player?
Not in purple.
No.
Though I think they play him in 2022.
Yeah. So not as a player. No. You know, eventually I really feel like they should have a couple of statues outside of the stadium of Viking greats or like Viking great moments, just so they can have a big thing of Favre out there too. But but just to troll Packers fans more, they really should have a little stadium statue of Diggs doing the throwing of the helmet or the extension. Just that'd be fun. I think he would return for a statue dedication, but I don't think he would return otherwise as a Viking. However, Arif, what are your thoughts on the Iditarod, and how are analytics revolutionizing the sport of sled dog racing? I like the Iditarod. We did a lot of looking into it when I was in, I think, middle school. For some reason, they brought sled dogs from the Iditarod to the school I was going to, and we had to do all sorts of like deep dives and a bunch of classes as to like how things work and how they're able to survive, the types of dogs they use, and how they have to just stress themselves to the point of near death, not just like the people do involved in it. It's crazy. I didn't know there was analytics involved, though.
I don't know if there must be. My understanding is that the animal abuse concerns that people raised like 3-5 years ago are generally not accurate. Maybe it's because I know some people who used to do dog sled racing and they've like biased me on this one. I don't know. My understanding is that the dogs are fine. It seems like a lot you're asking of the dogs, but they're more comfortable than you are for sure. Which I guess that's not the standard, but from my understanding, it's actually not abusive. Who knows? Someone please correct me if I'm wrong. From an analytics perspective, clearly GPS matters a lot, so that's probably important. And then I bet there's like a bunch of dog science that goes into it, like nutrition, at what speeds you can sustain for a period of time, whether or not you should interval. And these are all just guesses. I have no clue.
Now, dog science is important. Let's be clear.
Yeah. I mean, it's good boy science. Why wouldn't you want to invest in it? I'm sure there's all kinds of like how you structure your intervals, whether or not it makes sense to kind of push for, a couple more hours before resting, what time of day it makes sense to wake up, and get going. I'm sure there's a bunch of analytics on that. How much sleep is maximally important, whether or not it makes sense to rest the dogs for a period of time in between intervals. I bet all of that gets studied by the dog sledding analytics community, and I'm sure they yell at each other on Twitter a lot.
Oh, I would imagine the dog science people are all over that. Raul asks, 4 TCU prospects are expected to go in the first 2 rounds of the NFL draft, and all seemingly fit Viking needs. Rank cornerback Jeff Gladney, offensive tackle Lucas Niang, defensive tackle Ross Blacklock, and wide receiver Jalen Reagor. Is Reagor the type of wide receiver 3 you envision for the Vikings? From
my understanding, a lot kind of depends on Lucas Niang's health. if he's healthy, he's actually a pretty decent tackle prospect. From my understanding, is a kind of a second round guy, if healthy. Jalen Reagor needs to answer some questions about kind of his combine performance. He didn't really perform up to the level that many people expected. I do think he passes the Vikings threshold kind of regardless. Without a pro day, it's going to be kind of difficult to answer those questions. So I'm kind of curious about that. Blacklock is a borderline first round, second round pick. Gladney is kind of also a borderline first round, second round pick. So all of these guys are in kind of the same area. I would say Lucas Nyang is probably, out of the four of them, the guy that's clearly outside of the first round and also has additional concerns. So I would probably put him fourth. After that, I would argue that Blacklock is the player that has kind of the biggest drop off from him to the next defensive tackle. And so he might be more valuable, but from a pure talent perspective, I think Jeff Gladney is at the top, and then Jalen Reagor, and then Blacklock. But Blacklock might be the guy, maybe, that you'd pick above them just because you've got other cornerbacks and other receivers in the draft. So that becomes tough. I agree that all of these players in the first two rounds do seemingly fit the Vikings' needs. And so it is a really fascinating question. I didn't really think about it all, that there were a bunch of TCU guys in the same area. But yeah, I mean, the decision between the four depends kind of on your ability to grab other positions kind of later in the draft. And so probably, given the draft landscape, I'd go Blacklock, Gladney, Reagor, Niang. But from a pure talent perspective, I'd probably go Gladney, Reagor, Blacklock, Niang. So that's kind of how I would structure that. And then, is Reagor the type of wide receiver 3 you envision for the Vikings? Yeah. I think this question was submitted before Diggs was traded. So now we're asking about wide receiver 2. I think he's a starting quality receiver. So the fact that he's got yards after catch potential and pure speed as a deep threat, there's kind of a lot there to work with. So yeah, I think he's pretty good. I don't think, he's got kind of the full complement of skills that you want for a deep threat in terms of deep ball tracking and stuff like that. But I think he's a pretty good receiver.
Also from Raul, the Bills pick does not seem to position us much better for a blue chip talent. The premium talent that seems to fall to us most often is Georgia offensive tackle Andrew Thomas. He's not considered a scheme fit, but do you still take him?
I don't think I would take Andrew Thomas. I think that athleticism at tackle is pretty important. Obviously, when someone like Orlando Brown, fails the combine, and then, he does a pretty good job at his pro day. And it just seems like he's not a scheme fit. And so a ton of teams pass on him, and then the Ravens grab him, and he's actually playing super well. It's easy to think about that. And Andrew Thomas performed better at the combine than I had expected. So it's not as if, he's kind of this slow-footed guy, but I probably would not take him unless he was the only tackle left. And I don't think that's the scenario we're in. I think that you've got the potential to grab Josh Jones, or if you like Austin Jackson, I'm not a huge fan of Austin Jackson, but if you like Austin Jackson, you can grab him. And those are guys that are both scheme fits and first-round talent. So I would probably grab them first and then consider Andrew Thomas. I don't tend to think scheme fit is as important as others do. I, for example, still would have advocated, Will Hernandez over Pat Elflein or whatever. And you just have to live with the fact that it's not a scheme fit. But here, I don't think you're in such a bind when it comes to selecting tackles that you have to select outside a scheme fit. Now, pass protection is more important than run blocking, and that's kind of where scheme fit matters the most. So, again, if he's the last tackle with a first round grade, yeah, take him and then just worry about how you're going to run block later. But for the most part, I would go for a guy that has similar pass protection capability, but has the ability to kind of move down laterally.
Next question is going to be from Dusty O'Connell. I think he used to be on the show. I know, right? People keep saying that I have him buried in my basement or something. Not true. Dusty.
But here he is, definitely submitting questions for real.
I talked to him just yesterday, and he was proclaiming how the service industry in Denver is going through a bit of an apocalypse right now with the closing of all the restaurants due to the virus. So he is, in fact, alive. Dusty says, fact, ESPN can't ever stop talking about Tom Brady and the Patriots. Fact, ESPN can't bring itself to cover the Vikings until the playoffs. If Brady goes to the Vikings, would we hear it on ESPN?
I think so. I absolutely think so. Yeah. Because I don't think it's the Patriots. I think it's Brady and his success that do it. So, yeah, we hear about it all the time. I mean, ESPN could not stop covering Favre with the Vikings. So, yeah, there's precedent for it. The Vikings become a much more dynamic and interesting team. Not necessarily a better team, because Brady's fallen off, but much more interesting team.
I like that. Not necessarily a better team, but Damian Barrett, how will a 17th game even work? There's such symmetry with a 16-game system that I can't see how you crowbar in an extra game.
So Amy Trask, who occasionally writes for The Athletic, wrote something about the 17th game. I haven't read it yet, but I know one of her arguments is that it needs to be a neutral site game. And I agree. And you don't need to have those neutral site games be international. And the CBA that they agreed to doesn't have enough international games that the agreement allows for them to be able to do all 17 of those games on a neutral site. And it doesn't have to occur in like week 18 or whatever, right? Like the 17th game is just a reference to the game that would not have normally been scheduled. That can occur at any point in the season. So any of them can be neutral site games. So it doesn't have to be the international game. But it would be really cool to do it at different college stadiums, right? You could do it at the Coliseum, or not the Coliseum, but you could do it at the Rose Bowl. You could do one. You could do rivalry games, right? So like you could actually have cross-conference rivalries, of which there are a few, but maybe a couple at like I think Legion stadiums where they used to do the Iron Bowl in Alabama. That'd be really cool. There's obviously a bunch of college stadiums in Florida, and I think if you did the college stadiums early when those college teams are playing away, you might be able to do some of the northern college stadiums, like Michigan, holds 100,000 people. That'd be a lot of fun. Ohio State, obviously. So I think you should probably do them in neutral site games, and I think you need to do add a cross conference game. I don't know how you pick it, because like you said, there's a bunch of symmetry. What's really great about the 16 game schedule is that the two of the games that they add are people who finish at the same rank as you in the division. And I don't know how you do that from a conference standing. Maybe you, actually, that would be kind of interesting. If you, seeded out the whole conference playoff style, and then you played the same seed in your cross conference, that'd be pretty cool. You might end up playing the same cross conference team twice because, you might double schedule like the AFC East and the Patriots or something like that. But I would totally dig it. I think maybe that's the way to do it. And I'll link Amy Trask's article on this, which probably is more well thought out than this hasty answer, in the show notes.
Michael asks, where is James on the euphoria/depression spectrum with regard to signing and continuation of the golden age of ham versus the departure of Diggs? Wishing James a complete recovery. Appreciate that, Michael. There's a great GIF that I posted on Twitter from the show The Critic, where he opens up his schedule and per hour it's manic, depressive, manic, depressive, manic, depressive. I think we're at that point. And I think we're going to be fine until we're not. Kyle Slaby asks, need some quarantine YouTube material, and cooking YouTube isn't useful because access to ingredients will be tough. So what are you binging on YouTube then, Arif?
So I was going to say binging on Babish, but that's cooking YouTube, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
PBS Eons, really great stuff. Goes into geologic history of the Earth, evolutionary history, anthropologic history, a bunch of really great stuff at PBS Eons. Really well produced. The hosts are scientists in the field that they're talking about. And unlike a lot of scientists, they've got really powerful presentation skills, really good at it. It's I think part of a project done by the Vlog Brothers or Hank Green, and he tends to produce just some really excellent stuff. Crash Course, you can learn a lot. Speaking of Hank Green, I like the World History series there, which deals less with like geologic history and like, the beginning of the Anthropocene or the Cambrian explosion, and more, the beginning of human history and kind of how it's evolved from there. Really smart stuff. I like media criticism a lot. So Foldable Human, Dan Olson, really, really great, smart media criticism. I think the viral video that he had go around that a lot of people watched was Suicide Squad and the Art of Editing. That's really good. Lindsay Ellis, who collaborates with him occasionally, also does really great media criticism. They're both like lefties, so like watch out for that if you're not into that. But they're really smart and they're good at media criticism. For people who are like maybe a little bit more apolitical in their media criticism, I tend to find a lot of that in video game retrospectives. So, which they both are. Dan Olson does do video game retrospectives. So does H Bomber Guy, but he's clearly lefty, so don't worry about that. But Raycevik, Raycevik, did a series like Mass Effect 10 years later, Mass Effect 2 7 years later, Mass Effect 3 5 years later. And they're like hour-long videos, and they're just really great histories of the games. Like they don't just go into the criticism of the games, which they do, and there's a great exploration of that, but they also talk about like the production and how the game came together and kind of the stories behind the creators and stuff like that. And so I really enjoy that stuff a lot too. And then I also watch like commentary YouTube. It's really addictive. Drew Gooden, Cody Ko, Danny Gonzalez, Curtis Connor. They're all pretty fun. Tiffany Ferguson. They're all pretty good. So, yeah, that's like Eddie Burback. That's like 9 channels, right? That should be enough.
That should be enough for him. I have a really odd one to recommend. And it has nothing to do with my wife's job, but I've watched.
Wow, okay, that's a strong start.
I watch. For whatever reason, I just got sucked into a YouTube hole for the show for the channel Hollywood Graveyard, where they would go to graveyards in the Los Angeles area and find they would find like gravestones of famous actors and actresses, and not just the ones that you would expect, or this is Marilyn Monroe's thing. They'll have Marilyn Monroe, but they'll also have like singers and dancers from the 20s and 30s, or voices from Disney things that you wouldn't have remembered. That's like where they would have like caught on, like, oh, this is the this was the original Alice from Alice in Wonderland's voice, like that, like, and is full of a ton of great material. And for whatever reason, like, I don't know if it's just a super calming voice or the way that he does it, like, really respectfully, but you can just sit and watch those for a couple of hours and go, why is it dark out right now? Oh, because I've been watching these for hours. So I actually really enjoyed the Hollywood Graveyard series of videos. And he's still putting stuff out, and I think he just had like some ridiculous number of subscribers, like 1 or 2 million there. So
oh wow,
there's your really random thing. Kenneth Allen, how are you faring with the quarantine? Is it harder for James to find human victims for his son during these trying times? Always. It is always a challenge. Ricardo has my favorite question that I just got the answer to. Ricardo, good day, sirs. Just listening to the last episode while doing the dishes, and a question popped into my head. If James's back issues turn for the worst, does his wife stuff him like a bear or other large mammal? Follow-up question, how long would a job take? Follow-up to the follow-up, what position would she have him in? My favorite idea so far is upright with arms outstretched so that Mr. Hassan can jump into his arms, officer and a gentleman style, whenever he is feeling down. Thoughts?
Okay, hilarious. Also, funny detail. I am Mr. Hassan and you are James.
I don't
know what that means.
There's no respect for the dead here, apparently. Yeah. Unlike on the YouTube channel Hollywood Graveyard. So
circle it back.
I did just get the message though.
If you're posed upright with arms outstretched, I would want a little bit more support than jumping into your arms, officer and gentleman style, because then I'd have to hang off your neck. And I want you to be doing more of the work because you're dead and you're not actually doing work. And
story of Arif's life. I would like you to be doing more of the work.
Because you're dead. I'm not asking more of you. It's not rude. You can't do anything. So you like pose in a way that's maybe a little bit more stable so that when I feel the need to jump into your arms, I have to do a little bit less. I think that's fair. Yeah, I think stuff you like a bear, that makes sense. I mean, you're not as big as a bear, but you're closer to it than a lot of people.
We've had arguments about this before because I've said,
like, not a discussion, arguments.
No, we've had full blown arguments about this, about whether or not I get to have my wish of being cremated and having my ashes spread in this little part of St. Paul. And she has full out declared that I'm going to be stuffed in the house at some point. So the answer to the question is, given your height, burly manliness, and possible issues of circulation, I'd take my time to make sure everything is right. So about 3 hours start to finish, but not including any cosmeticizing, dressing, or appendage setting. As for position, be in a human teddy bear position for hugs. Right? Yeah. Maybe 4 hours embalming. Maybe. So hey, they asked the question. I had to go to the source for this. That's just wrong. So
hold on. Just one last thing.
Yes.
Why doesn't she just like lie to you and say, yeah, I'll cremate you and spread your ashes to the part of St. Paul that's very important to you. I know that like emotionally this carries a lot of resonance. And then, if you die before her, she's just like, well, I'm glad he's comforted in knowing that I'm going to do this thing. And then she just like doesn't do it. And like, you don't know.
No, she's reached that point now. She's just agreed that that's what's going to end up happening.
Right. Because she respects her wishes.
No, you're misreading that. She's agreed to tell me that that's what's going to end up happening.
So, follow up to that.
There's a follow up.
Do you think she's like planning on pursuing additional relationships after you pass? And if so, when she takes people to her place, do they like see like you ready to give a hug as a teddy bear, and does she have to explain that's my ex, but without making it seem like a threat?
I don't know how one manages to make that not a threat with a 6'5", 300-ish pound guy in the corner. I don't understand how that, that's got conversation starter written all over it though. And on that note, Arif, what do you have to plug from The Athletic?
I've written like 4,000 words, man. Just go to The Athletic. There's stuff. I don't want to talk about it.
The time for talk is over. The time is now for action. Again, want to thank you everyone so much for sticking around. This episode got ridiculously long for good reason. We had a lot of things to talk about. And there will be much more to talk about likely next week or so. So we will be returning soon to discuss more Vikings things. Please check out the Patreon exclusive information that we posted about kind of around the league stuff, which is a little over half an hour, and I hope you guys appreciate that. We're just trying a couple of things, seeing if this ends up working, if this is something we want to pursue further. So hope you guys enjoy that. For Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and please remember to bring your wine towel. And we will see you soon.
Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/Norse Code, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/Norse Code. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.